Hi, I'm Bob Campbell with Alliance Solutions Group, and this video is part two in a series of videos on situational awareness and decision making. The content of this video comes from a course we developed in partnership with FEMA on crisis leadership and decision making. This course was designed, developed, and delivered to over 1,000 public safety and private sector decision makers throughout the United States. So I want to share a few useful pieces of information on situational awareness. In part one, we talked about a situational awareness model and what is situational awareness, and the first level of that is perception. The second level, which we're going to talk about in this video, is comprehension or sense making of data. And the third, which we'll cover in a separate video, has to do with projection or projecting into the future in order to make good decisions. Situational awareness is key in developing an accurate perception of reality in order to make higher quality decisions. And so in our first module, we talked about perception of data and how our perception of data is out of context. And it's important to understand that the data that we're getting needs to be accurate, valid, and reliable. And some things that could come into play is maybe error. I gave the example of sampling for COVID and doing the testing. So number of testing, number of cases, the lack of context. There's sampling error when the tests are administered. There's limits of detection when they're analyzed. There's analytical error that may occur based on the media that's utilized or the type of swab. We talked about mortality and how the context of that statistic is somewhat erroneous because we're missing a key piece of information, which is the denominator, and there's some ambiguity even in the numerator of mortality as to what truly is the cause of death. So let me kind of shift gears here, and I want to talk about sense making or comprehension, which is the next level. And this is what we need to do with our data. There are three things that need to happen in order to take our data and make sense of it or translate it into information, as I like to say. Those three things are: first, we need to define normal, or the lower bound. We need to define an unacceptable standard, which would be a higher bound. And we need to identify action levels, where we're going to take action on things. So let me break that down just a little bit and put this into some greater context. So the first step is defining normal or a datum so that we can compare data. So if we get a certain number, whether it's a mortality rate, number of deaths, number of cases, those sorts of things, we need to put that piece of data into context with what's normal. Is it abnormal what we're getting, or is it normal? What's the acceptable standard? And this acceptable standard might actually change over time. So what is the baseline? So before our country returns to some normalcy and we reopen things up, what are we defining as normal? What is it? 0 cases? Is it 0 deaths? Is it 2 weeks without a case? That seems to be the trend right now as to where we're going. But 0 is truly unrealistic, and so we need to define what that is. The other piece of information or context related to this is that just because we might return to a certain level of cases or deaths, the conditions have changed. The environmental conditions have changed, and that's part of situational awareness. Those conditions are the implementation of social distancing and other restrictions, more hand washing, people being more safe when they go outside, but perhaps putting on masks or distancing themselves. So just because we get down to that level or a higher level that was unacceptable on the upside of the curve may be acceptable on the downside of the curve because of the changes in the environment and changes in practices. But that normality needs to be defined in whatever situation we're trying to make decisions about. The second item is what is unacceptable. We got to define what is unacceptable. This is the upper bound. This might be a unimaginable condition. It might be something we've defined in a plan, or it may be something that we're revising as we go along. But what would be unacceptable? So right now, under the current guidelines for reopening, having new cases and deaths within a previous 2 week, an increase in those within the last 2 weeks, is what is being defined as is unacceptable for moving on to the next phase. However, that definition could change, and someone may interpret a different set of circumstances as unacceptable. But it's important to define that in order to make sense of your data. So what's normal, what's abnormal, where are we at, and how does our data fit into that, even though they're not always easily comparable. The third item is what's the action level? And I think it's important when we're thinking about action levels, this is our decision point. It's important to figure out what metrics are we really using to make decisions. Are these lagging indicators? Perhaps the number of deaths is a lagging indicator because they've already happened. Is it the number of cases we're predicting based on mortality rate 2 weeks ago based on the number of deaths today? That could be a lagging indicator. Or is it a leading indicator telling us what is going to happen, the direction of things? Is it the number of deaths or number of cases relative to yesterday and the day before? That may be more of a leading indicator. So interpreting our data in the context of a lower bound and upper bound, and whether it's a leading or lagging indicator so that we can make better decisions, helps us make sense of the data and ultimately make better decisions.